Stories from Maine is a collection of true tales and legendary stories of daring, heroism, absurdity, disaster, and spectacle, all proving why many of the greatest legends in American history are our stories from Maine. In this episode of Stories from Maine, we observe Women's History Month by looking back on one of the most infamous women of Nazi Germany, whose radio broadcasts served as a propaganda weapon aimed directly at American and Allied troops. She eventually came to be known as Axis Sally, and this weapon of war was a woman from Portland, Maine. Stay with us now and hear the true tale of an American traitor on this all-new episode of Stories from Maine. Our podcast begins right now.
This is our Stories from Maine podcast for the third week in March 2025. Stories from Maine is authored by historian Lori Suzanne Dell. Her books, Stories from Maine and Stories from Maine 2, as well as all of her books, are available through book retailers and can be found on Amazon. You can follow Stories from Maine on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and Spotify at Stories from Maine. And now, you can also find Stories from Maine on TikTok. Now, let's head over to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
Let's take a look back 205 years ago this week to March 15th of 1820, when the great state of Maine won her statehood to become the 23rd state in the American Union. Passage of the Missouri Compromise of 1820 saw Maine created as a free state, where slavery was outlawed. This allowed Missouri to become a state where slavery was permitted, thus, keeping a balance between pro-slavery and anti-slavery representation in Congress. The Missouri Compromise would eventually be nullified by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, but statehood for Maine remained. I'll be back with another segment of This Week in Maine History a little later in the broadcast. Now, let's turn the program over to Oscar, who has this week's feature story of an American traitor from Portland, Maine.
One of the most notorious propaganda weapons of the German war machine in Nazi Germany during World War II was an American woman whose Nazi radio broadcasts spread false news and pro-German sentiments in an effort to demoralize American and Allied soldiers in Europe. Her well-known broadcasts earned her the nickname of Axis Sally. And this woman was from Portland, Maine. Mildred Elizabeth Sisk was born in Portland on November 29th of 1900 to Vincent Sisk and Mary Hewitson. Mildred and her family resided in Portland, where she was schooled until she was 11 years old. Mildred grew up in an abusive home, terrorized by an alcoholic father. But when Mildred's father died, the abuse she suffered at the hands of her father finally came to an end. Now, Mildred's mother was free to marry again. Only this time, she married a dentist named Robert Gillers, who soon after moved his new family out of Maine and into Bellevue, in Ohio. After graduation from high school in Ohio, Mildred moved to New York City, where she wanted to become a theatrical actress. Mildred worked mostly in vaudeville, and she spent some time on Broadway. But in 1929, Gillers moved again. This time, Mildred went on to travel to France and to Africa, and she eventually ended up in Germany, where she soon took on a job as an announcer at a state-run German radio station. But Germany was undergoing severe political changes. After 1919, punishments inflicted by the countries who defeated Germany in World War I completely devastated the people of Germany. The Deutschmark was worthless. Supplies of food were at a minimum, and the people of this once great nation were completely demoralized. But one man rose to power as he promised to rebuild the national economy and restore pride to the people. While Adolf Hitler's Nazi Party now gripped the nation in a tight fist of nationalism, Hitler's rebuilt German military began the policy known as the Lebensraum to expand the nation of Germany by invading other nations and seizing their lands. Soon, the offensive military conflict consumed Europe and led to World War II. Though she may not have realized it at the time, Mildred was about to become the most famous voice of Nazism known the world over. We'll be right back.
We hope you are enjoying this episode of our free podcast. Please help us in bringing you more episodes by liking, subscribing, following, and commenting on our Stories from Maine content on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, and Spotify. Your interaction allows us to keep our podcast free for all to enjoy. Now, let's go back to James for another segment of This Week in Maine History.
In this next segment of This Week in Maine History, in recognition of Women's History Month, we revisit March 20th of 1852, when Brunswick, Maine author Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is published. The book brings a vivid image of the plight of American slavery in the southern states to the imaginations of all Americans. For many living in the northern half of a divided nation, Stowe's book convinces its readers of the horrors and unfair cruelty of slavery. Many Americans living in the North, at the time, were apathetic to Southern slavery, and few knew of the inhumanity being inflicted upon these slaves. The book changes many of the hearts and minds of the North, and Stowe's book is credited by President Abraham Lincoln as having caused the American Civil War. Now, let's go back to Oscar for more of our feature story.
By 1942, as World War II was well underway, both Germany and Japan were both using radio as their best weapon in the battle of propaganda. In Japan, Tokyo Rose became the most well-known Japanese broadcaster in the War of the Pacific. For American troops in Europe, Mildred Gillers, or Axis Sally, quickly became the Tokyo Rose of the European theater of war. When the Nazi Party propaganda machine undertook to prepare for the eventuality of Americans entering the European war, German Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, pressured Mildred to disseminate his pro-Nazi scripts on her radio program, Home Sweet Home. Giller's work was to spread carefully scripted propaganda in an attempt to dissuade and demoralize American, English, and Allied forces from taking aggressive actions against Germany. Her stories, comments, and skits, all performed on air, also combined with top 40 music and other entertainment to ensure that foreign troops would remain interested in listening. And the German government saw to it that Giller's programs were broadcast directly and specifically at American and Allied troops. And Axis Sally's radio broadcasts were not just aimed at American and Allied troops. Giller's propaganda was also aimed directly at Americans at home as well.
This is Berlin calling, and I'd just like to say that when Berlin calls, it pays to listen. Good evening, women of America. Well, you know, as time goes on, I think of you more and more. I can't somehow seem to get you out of my head. You women in America, waiting for the one you love, waiting and weeping in the secrecy of your own room, thinking of the husband, the son, or the brother who is being sacrificed by Franklin D. Roosevelt, perishing on the fringes of Europe.
Although these broadcasts by Axis Sally were meant to have an adverse and psychological effect on American and Allied troops and their families, most American troops actually enjoyed her programs. These battle-hardened troops already understood that her program was simple pro-Nazi propaganda, and most Americans back home also found her ridiculously amusing. And though many Americans referred to her as Axis Sally, some called her the Berlin Bitch. We'll be right back.
Our all-new Stories from Maine podcast episodes stream each Saturday on our YouTube and Spotify channels. Please follow us each week, as we highlight many of the greatest legends in Maine history. And please join us, and 40,000 followers, on our Facebook page, where we post new content each day. Now, let's go back to Oscar, for the conclusion of this week's feature story.
This is a solemn but glorious hour. General Eisenhower informs me that the forces of Germany have surrendered to the United Nations.
When the European War ended on VE Day, May 8th of 1945, Hitler was dead, Goebbels was on the run, and Mildred Gillers had vanished. The United States military and the Allied powers were busy rounding up Nazi leaders, and they especially wanted to find Nazi Germany's Axis Sally. Gillers was considered an important enemy who was the official voice of Nazi Germany and was therefore a significant Nazi leader. But American officials also wanted her for treason, as she was still an American citizen, one who took sides against the United States during a time of war. Now, with the defeat of Germany in place, Gillers was just an American traitor, hiding in Germany and on the run from American justice. For nearly 1 year, Gillers evaded capture, but she couldn't run for long. Finally, on March 15th of 1946, nearly 1 year after Germany surrendered, Axis Sally was located and arrested in Berlin. By August 21st of 1948, Gillers was transported back to America, and within a month Mildred Elizabeth Gillers was indicted on 10 counts of treason against the United States.
The 7 weeks treason trial comes to a close as the jury file into the federal courthouse. After 29 hours deliberation, they find guilty Mildred Gillers, the Nazis' wartime radio propagandist, known as Axis Sally. Protesting that love was her undoing, the first woman in modern history convicted of treason faces a maximum sentence of death.
Gillers was sentenced to 10 to 30 years in prison, but was paroled in June of 1961, after serving only 12 years in federal lockup. Mildred Gillers then joined a Catholic convent and spent the remainder of her life teaching in a Catholic school. She lived in Ohio until the age of 88, when she died from colon cancer in June of that year. In 2021, a major motion picture starring Al Pacino and Meta Williams told the story of the dramatic trial of Axis Sally, a woman who had been a major propaganda weapon of the Third Reich and the first American female traitor in United States history. And now, the story of Mildred Elizabeth Gillers, better known as Axis Sally, remains one of the more treacherous and perfidious of our Stories from Maine.
Our Stories from Maine podcast streams each Saturday, with all new weekly podcast episodes. Until then, please join us, and nearly 40,000 others, by following us on our Facebook page, for daily content from Maine's great history. And please like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast on our YouTube and Spotify channels. You can also find our books, Stories from Maine, and Stories from Maine 2, The Legends Continue, as well as all of Laurie Suzanne Dell's books, through all book retailers and on Amazon. All original Stories from Maine content is copyright 2025, with all rights reserved. Stories from Maine is a registered trademark of Laurie Suzanne Dell. You may contact Stories from Maine by emailing storiesfrommaine@gmail.com. See you next week, and thank you for listening.